Well, this past Sunday, we talked about a subject that most people that I know, or at least many people that I know, would be happy for us to avoid. I've actually talked with plenty of people who sort of parse out the money conversation as a separate thing in their spiritual lives. And they don't see it as being part and parcel to who we are as people who are pursuing God or followers of Jesus. And if I could be so bold, with all due respect, nothing could be further from the truth. When we gave our lives to Jesus, when I gave my life to Jesus, it was an all-in holistic commitment and dedication. It wasn't, I don't get to cordon off some portion of my life and say, I'm following Jesus with all this over here, and not this one section or part of my life over here. As someone has once said, if you're not following Jesus with all, you're not following Jesus at all. So it really is important for our spiritual lives for us to reconcile this. You cannot parse out one part of your life and say, this part I'm not going to dedicate to God. And so if we can go there, if we can agree that God owns it all, not just in the world, but in my life, all of it, including the financial part of my life, then we've got to start saying, okay, if God owns everything, if God is the Lord, that is the director of all of my life, including my finances, well, then how can I direct my finances in such a way that is consistent with my confession of faith, my testimony that I am a follower of Jesus? Well, the first thing we have to do is we have to admit that that we're not being good stewards of what God has entrusted to us to spend more than we bring in. I was in college. I was a young, I was probably 20, and I took my first economics class. And the professor there, I was in this class with like 300 people in this mass communications room at VCU, and this really old lady walks out on the platform. She's got like a cane and a hump. She's hunched over, and she's a professor of macroeconomics, and she walks out. I'll never forget the one thing she says, probably the only thing I remember. She said, the problem in America is not the debt. The problem in America is the deficit. I'll never forget that. By the way, we were only like, $700 billion in debt then, not 27 trillion. That's another conversation. I always thought about that on a personal level. We're going to talk about debt at some point and how we dig out of the hole of debt if we're in it. But the problem is really not the debt. We can solve the problem of the debt. The problem is we have to stop the bleeding. So if you'll think back to Sunday when we talked about that, big barrel and the money, the water represented kind of the money, you got inflows and outflows. And when that barrel is continuing to drop, when the water in the barrel is continuing to drop, what it represents is that my outflows exceed my inflows. That's a deficit. If you make, $50,000 a year and you spend $60,000 a year, that's a deficit. And it's the same as if you make $1 million a year and you spend $2 million a year. That's a deficit. You can't perpetually spend more than you make. In fact, the writer of Hebrews had something to say about this, and I wanted to point that out to you. He says in chapter 13, he says in verse 5, keep your lives free from the love of money and be content with what you have. Because God has said, never will I leave you, never will I forsake you. Basically, what the writer of Hebrews is saying is, you've got enough. You've got enough already. Be content with what you have. When we run a consistent deficit in our lives, we spend more than we bring in, we are not being content with what God has entrusted to us. And if I could be so bold, that is not faithful. That is not where God wants us to live. And the way to solve this is not complicated. It really isn't. It might be painful, but it's also simple. You write down what you bring in, and you make sure that you don't spend more than that every month. And the way you do that is a budget. And people aren't crazy about this because it's forced discipline into our lives. And we don't like to live with discipline. But if we're going to be a healthy follower of Jesus, and if we're going to live without the burden and the anxiety of the financial stress all the time, if we're going to build margin, then we have to build a budget. This is deeply spiritual. You'd be hard pressed to open the pages of the Bible anywhere and not find some scripture about money. Let me read to you two in particular that I really want to focus on today. One is from Matthew chapter 6. This is the Sermon on the Mount. And Jesus says this in verse 19, do not store up for yourselves treasures on earth where moth and vermin destroy and where thieves break in and steal, but store up for yourselves treasures in heaven where moth and vermin do not destroy and thieves do not break in and steal. For where your treasure is, there your heart will be also. Now, some of us would say, well, my treasure is not in my money, but the way that we spend our money is indicative that our treasure is in, I don't know, stuff, the accumulation of stuff, luxury, entertainment. We could go down the list, things that money can buy, which then becomes a little bit of a technicality. We might not be in love with money per se, but we're in love with all the things that money can do. And what Jesus is saying is we have to turn our attention towards him. And in doing so, we will self-correct, not by accident, but with deliberate intent. Jesus goes on in one of my cornerstone scriptures, which I've talked about here in this forum many times, from Matthew 25. I can't encourage you enough to study this. It begins in verse 14, and the summary of this parable that Jesus tells is that there's this master, he has 3 servants, and he gives them different levels of trust. Now, to one he gives 5 bags of gold, to the other he gives 2 bags, and to the other he gives 1 bag, and the master goes off, and he entrusts these servants to get a return on the investment. Now, he comes back for an accounting, and the first 2 servants, they worked hard, and they got a return on the investment. The third servant buries his 1 bag of gold, and then the master has not so encouraging things to say to him. But the whole moral of the parable, the point of the parable, is to say you are responsible with what God has entrusted to you. And the application of this parable is lots of different areas. I've used this to think about how I spend my time, how I spend my energy, how I exert my talent and my gifts, but it's also about money. God has entrusted us with wealth. Now, I know most of us don't think of ourselves as wealthy. I certainly don't think of myself as wealthy, but I've been to some places in the world where there would be no question that the way that I live, and all due respect, the way that you live, is wealthy. And the question that I think Jesus is posing here, if you're a serious follower of Jesus, we have to ask this question is my wealth reflecting my allegiance? And that begins with making sure that I'm not outspending my wealth, that I'm not spending it to the point that it looks like I don't trust God or like I want something more than I want God. So in 1 Timothy chapter 6, verse 6, it says this, godliness with contentment is great gain. For we brought nothing into the world, and will take nothing out of the world. But if we have food and clothing, we will be content with that. Those who want to get rich fall into temptation and a trap, and into many foolish and harmful desires that plunge people into ruin and destruction. For the love of money is a root of all kinds of evil. Some people, eager for money, have wandered from the faith and pierced themselves with many griefs. Now, we don't have time to unpack this entire text here now, but I'm telling you, there's all kinds of important truth about how we think about money. One note that I want to make sure you see. Now, sometimes people misquote this text and they say, well, money is the root of all evil. That is not what what Paul is saying to Timothy here. What Paul is saying is, in fact, let me quote him again. The love of money is a root of all kinds of evil. So money is a tool, not just for your pleasure and your happiness, but it is a tool that God uses to do his purpose through you and through me. So we have to reorient our perspective on this. If our paradigm shifts about the way we think about money, then we can get to the technique of how are we using our money. Things like, am I living within my means? Am I controlling the outflow to match the inflow? Now, I'll just tell you from my personal story here that I've lived my life in 2 different ways. It's sort of the tale of 2 Brians in terms of finances. I've lived my life such that I was not faithful with what God entrusted to me, not just in terms of giving, though that was a part of it, but in terms of the way that I lived my life, in terms of loving money and what money could buy, and pursuing things and the status that things could represent, like really nice cars that I could not afford, and a lifestyle that was really outsized for my income. And it was disastrous, not just on a financial level. It was disastrous on a spiritual level because I was torn in terms of my allegiance. Just like Jesus said, a man can't serve two masters, for he'll love the one, hate the other, or be devoted to the one and despise the other. Jesus said you cannot serve both God and money. And many of us are trying to do just that. Fixing our finances and living with margin begins with a shift in paradigm. You can apply the technique, but you won't be motivated to stick with it until you change the way you think about money. Now I see money as a powerful tool. And when I made that shift in my life, I went from disaster to prosperous. And I don't mean prosperous in terms of American level of wealth, but in terms of building margin into my life. And all of a sudden, actually it wasn't all of a sudden, it was over time, I was able to God was able to work through me to create a scenario where I don't feel stressed about it all the time. I've got a little bit of margin, and I can handle it when the storms of life come, and I can be faithful to God no matter what he wants me to do with his money. You can get there too. And it's a worthwhile conversation for us to have with our families, in our marriages, with our small groups. It doesn't have to be some big private secret thing. Money's just a tool that God gives us, just one more tool. And we ought to treat it like that. So I hope you have a good conversation. And look, next week, we're going to have an amazing celebration at PCC to think back about all that God has done in the last 2 years at our church through the More Initiative. And it really has been amazing. I hope you won't miss it. Lots and lots of fun we're going to have on that day. And bring a friend, because people will be intrigued about what our church is doing to make a difference in the world. I think they'll raise an eyebrow in a good way at that. So I'll see you then. I hope you bring a friend. And we'll see you then.